This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 337, which is all about wonderful learnings from travel. I'd firstly like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast today. So we are talking all about the things we learn about ourselves and what we learn about the cultures and places we visit and what we learn from those experiences in today's episode. Now, I was pondering this, and there's probably thousands of wonderful learnings I've had from travel. I think that having lived abroad for quite a few years and travelled, a fair bit, I actually don't think that I can separate anymore what this travel and living in other countries has taught me or how it's especially shaped me as a person, other than to say I am 100% sure I'd be fundamentally different without it. I think everything about how I approach life would be completely other. So I know that some of these wonderful learnings have really shaped me. Now, today's guests have also, they've got a variety of these learnings, both large and small in all kinds of travel contexts, and I hope you enjoy their stories. So my first guest is Thomas Swick, and Thomas chats about what travel has taught him about himself and what he learns from the particular vantage point of being a travel writer who travels.
When I left Poland, I went to Greece because I had a friend in Athens who I thought I could stay with for a while and maybe find a job for the winter. And I did, but it wasn't in Athens. It was way up in the north, a town called Arta. I got a job teaching English, and one day a week, the director would take me to this village nearby. It was really a tiny, tiny village, but they had a little school there, and I taught students for 1 hour. But I remember the first class I did in that village, at one point, a whole flock of sheep with a shepherd came walking down the street outside the classroom. And I just stopped. I mean, I'd never seen a shepherd before. And to me, he had a real aura. He was a biblical, to me, he was a kind of a biblical figure. And the students just laughed because, to him, to them, he was just, the village simpleton, the guy with the sheep. The thing is, you obviously, you learn a lot about the places you travel, but then you learn something about yourself. One thing I noticed when I was, again, in Greece, I went to the Polish embassy one day in Athens to see if I could get a visa to go back to Poland just for a couple of weeks that summer in June. And I met an American who had been living in Poland as well. And we'd both taken this series of trains from Warsaw to Athens, like overnight train from Warsaw to Budapest, and Budapest to Bucharest, and Bucharest to Sofia, and Sofia to Athens. And it was grueling. I mean, in the middle of the night, you'd invariably come to a border, and they'd wake you up and ask for passports, and they'd always take the American passport away. And at checks, I don't know what, but everybody would sit there and look at you accusingly because you were causing the train to be delayed. Mm-hmm. It was cold. I never was able to get a couchette. I slept sitting up. I ate very little. I mean, 4 nights like this. The station in Bucharest especially was very forbidding. And so I saw this American who'd taken the same trains, and I wanted to kind of share war stories with him. And he was blasé, totally blasé about it. He said, "Oh yeah, that was nothing." And I thought, And I started to think, maybe I'm not cut out to be a travel writer. This trip for me was traumatic. It was a huge undertaking, and this guy just kind of breezed through it. I thought he's the ideal traveler. He's just going along smoothly. Nothing phases him. But then I thought about it later, and I realized, to write about something, it has to make an impression on you, and he could never have written about it, because it was nothing to him. Mm-hmm. He was he was a great traveler. I mean, but it was nothing that he would feel compelled to write about.
Mm.
Where I was stressed and I was nervous and I was everything. To me, it was just such a survival moment in my life. I never had a journey that was that
Arduous.
eventful and traumatic. Yeah, and I couldn't, my first month in Greece, I spent writing an article about this trip because
Mm-hmm.
it made such an impression on me.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized then that you don't have to be a great traveler to be a great travel writer. In fact, if you're a kind of frazzled and nervous and bumbling traveler, it may produce a more interesting story.
I totally agree. And also more relatable, because way more of us would
Yes,
find that 4-night journey arduous than the very small percentage of people who would just breeze through and think it was fine.
right.
So, yeah, makes it more interesting and relatable to the reader as well. So,
Right, he was like the James Bond character, whereas I was the guy who wrote I was Ian Fleming writing James Bond stories.
yes, good analogy. Yeah. I love train journeys, but that
I do
does
too.
sound like a little bit too much.
Yeah, I called it the Iron Curtain Local because we went,
All
through
stops.
basically every Iron Curtain country except Yugoslavia at the time.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it was, yeah, as I say, it definitely made an impression. But if you say somebody's impressionable, it's not a flattering thing, yeah. But the thing about being impressionable is it leaves a lot of impressions, so it gives you things to write about.
It's amazing. I was just, yeah, I'm a little bit envious being in that region back in those years. Would have been just so interesting.
It was very different. I mean, it was still Europe, but it was very different than Western Europe.
Mm.
I'd spent a year in France, but
Mm.
that kind of prepared me a little bit for what I would find. But yeah, it was a different world. And we in the U.S. We tended to lump all those countries together.
Mm-hmm. Same,
Eastern
yeah.
Europe, just one
Contiguous
kind of
mass.
faceless, forgettable whole. And I saw the differences as I traveled on that train. I remember arriving in Budapest. Budapest, even back then, was a beautiful city, and it was much wealthier than Warsaw. It still had a kind of Western glamour to it.
Mm.
And Bucharest was just the opposite. Bucharest made me really miss Warsaw. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see Sofia because shortly after our train arrived, that I saw that there was a train leaving for Athens within an hour, so I never got out of the train station. But what I remember about Bulgaria, when we'd stop at towns, people would come and take our water bottles and fill them
Oh.
with spring water because Bulgaria is famous for its water.
Yes, yes.
And that was just such a nice
How
gesture that they would
lovely.
go off and fill our water bottles. Yeah, it was a great trip, but I didn't. I did get the visa to go back to Poland in June.
Oh, for the short visit.
Yeah, and I flew. I did not take this. I did not take the trains
Once
back.
was enough. To summarize there, traveling does teach us a lot about ourselves, I think. I think often it teaches us more about ourselves than it does about what we're traveling through.
And I think especially at that age.
Yes.
I was in my 20s, so you're discovering the world, but you're also discovering about yourself.
Completely agree that travel at any age teaches us much about ourselves, but in your 20s, when you are just really working yourself out as an adult, as an independent adult, then absolutely. I lived abroad from age 25 to 30-ish, and that's one way I would be entirely different if I hadn't done that, I'm sure. Thomas's chat also reminded me of some of those times when I was the cause of border delays. I'm thinking especially like buses also in Eastern Europe. I remember crossing from, it must have been from St. Petersburg, bus across to Narva in Estonia. Only non Europeans on the bus, and our Australian passports had to be taken off. We had to come off separately. All sorts of extra delays just because we were maybe, I don't know, just not in the usual spot where we should have been. So sorry to all those people whose journeys I disrupted with my tricky passport. Anyway, my next guest is Angela Correll, and I also asked her about some of the curious learnings she'd had from travel And she certainly had many, and they were in particular from her time living in Italy.
I think I'm going to start one with the Italian rest period, which many of us are somewhat aware of. But I think being in a small village, it's different from if you just travel to Rome and to Florence and Venice, because in those cities, they're very much geared towards tourists. And I don't think they quite shut down like a small village does.
Right.
But what I had to adjust to is that in Italy, if I'm running errands, I have to literally time my errands so that I am finished by 12:30 or 1 at the latest, because after that, nothing's open till 4:00, truly. I mean, some things might open at 3, but which is so different for me as American, because a lot of times I'll go have lunch at 12 and then at 1 or 1:30, I'm out running errands. And it's the exact opposite in Italy. In fact, there is this in the village. If I'm in my house and somebody knocks on my door or rings the doorbell at 1:30, 2, I know it's not an Italian, because that is like a sacred space, and they do not bother. They won't come to your door unless they're invited for some reason. There's no meetings that are scheduled during that time. And while that's very curious for me, I actually love the fact that they hold that space for rest and eating with their family and just taking a little time during the middle of the day to recalibrate. And I think so often in our culture, we don't do that. We're eating on the run. We're drinking coffee on the run. We're going to the next thing, eating in our car. And just the fact that they take that very seriously and make it almost sacred, I think is really fascinating and inspiring. And then the other thing that I find so curious about Italians or the Italian culture is not only it really goes beyond food and their obsession with food. Every Italian, the conversation always turns to food and, the way to prepare something or using fresh ingredients, take foods very seriously. But a step beyond that is the digestion. They are very interested and concerned about how the body digests food. And there are these little cultural rules that you do not have milk after lunch. So Americans will go and they'll have a cappuccino at 2:00. Well, Italians are cringing. They're thinking this is not right. It's bad for your body. And they would not have milk at all really after lunch. Maybe a tiny macchiato with just a little foam would be okay, but they would not have any kind of milk. And so they take that seriously. And then the whole way the meal is scheduled in Italy, the pacing of it with the antipasta and the primo, the pasta, the secondo, which is the meat course, and then the dessert, and then you never have coffee with your dessert. I don't know how they do in Australia, but Americans frequently would have coffee with dessert. No, not at all. You have the coffee after dessert, and then and I'm not saying every meal, this is a big multi-course meal, but then after the coffee comes a digestivo, which could be like a limoncello or possibly mirto in Tuscany or a vinsanto, but it's some kind of, it's a liqueur that is usually infused with some kind of herbs or spices, and that is supposed to help the digestion. So that's why it's called a digestivo. I think the whole meal in Italy is really about the pacing of the food and giving yourself time to digest each course, and that's why you have one course, and then I think then you wait a bit and everybody finishes, and then a second course is brought out, and they're not in a hurry because the body needs that time to digest. And I don't know, it's just been really fascinating to learn. I had a super funny thing happen with a house cleaner. I actually included that in the book that I just turned in yesterday. But one of the house cleaners that came to clean our house went over to my spice rack, and she pulled almost all of the spices off my spice rack. And she kind of gave me the wagging finger, and she said, "These have to be thrown away," in Italian. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because they're expired. They're bad for the mouth." And she said, "Male for the digestion." So really bad for the digestion. And I thought, okay, so what else do you do? I said, okay, throw them away. But it just was so funny to me because I could not imagine any scenario in the U.S. where a house cleaner would attack my spice rack unless I had said, do you mind to go through my spice rack and see? I mean, it was just part of their culture. This is just not good. You do not need these in your house.
And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, there's plenty of spices in my spice rack that probably have expired, but like...
I know exactly. I was thinking, I don't even want to look at my spice rack here in Kentucky because there's no telling.
I guess in the States, it's probably similar to Australia. We eat in many multicultural ways. And so we have the foods, but we've kind of lost all of the other meanings behind it. So, yeah, we eat Italian food, but we don't know or have really any understanding of that process and all of the decisions that get made for probably quite sound reasons, but we just don't do any of that.
It is interesting.
Super interesting.
And it is, I think it's part of the nature of our global world and global travel. We take these pieces of a culture, but without really understanding, like you said, what's behind it.
Yeah, I think some of our wonderful learnings from travel can only happen in those original places where different cultural norms have arisen and so on. It's not the same when they've been exported to like a multicultural country like Australia. All right, my final guest today is Daniel Troia, and Daniel is a real adventurer who sets up situations where he's going to learn a lot. And this story is about his time spent riding a bicycle across America without food or money.
A few years ago, I was riding my bicycle across America, and I was doing it without bringing any food or money with me. And I had a sign that said, biking across country, ran out of food, anything helps. And I was stopping in front of grocery stores, etc. And if I was fortunate to receive help, I'd ask the person, hey, do you have a story about when somebody helped you and you really needed it? And so I was learning about compassion and empathy. And I was living this unique lifestyle for 7 months. I traveled across about 7,000 miles, 19 states across the United States. And I was stealth camping, so I was sleeping kind of like in public places. And at times it was difficult to find places to bathe, and the stealth camping sometimes led to dangerous situations. And just the lifestyle I was living, it was combined with dumpster diving for food, etc. And after 7 months of living this lifestyle, I was really starting to feel mentally and physically broken down. And at about month 6, I was about 600 miles away from home, and I thought I wasn't going to be able to bike the last 600 miles. I really wanted to complete the trip, but I was feeling so, mentally destroyed. And I was sitting on the side of the road trying to stretch my body. People were walking past me, and this person stops, and he says, hey, man, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm okay, man. I'm just feeling a little beat up, And he said, well, hold on, hang on a second, man. I'll be right back. And so this man, he runs across the street to a grocery store. He comes back a couple minutes later with a bag of groceries. And he says, hey, man, these are for you. And he bought me a bag of groceries, right? And I didn't know it, but this man was living on the streets. He was unhoused. Yep. And he bought me a bag of groceries with his food stamps. And this was one of the most impactful moments of my life, because in that moment when I was really needing help, he picked up on my energy, and I believe that he picked up on the energy and other people didn't, because he had faced a lot of hardships in his life. So he was able to relate to that energy. And the interesting thing is in that moment, I didn't need groceries. I had groceries, but what I needed was to be seen and acknowledged by somebody. And Gary, who was unhoused, picked up on the energy and showed up for me. And then we shared a hug, and it was extremely special. And honestly, that moment, I remember feeling like after that, it gave me the inspiration and the motivation to ride the next 600 miles. And Gary changed my life.
It's a beautiful story. So did you end up then chatting with him further and finding out more about his own story?
We did. Yeah. Gary, he had a brain tumor. He had a brain tumor, and he was separated from his daughter. He hadn't seen his daughter for a long time. And the sad reality was he was scared about sleeping on the streets, because he was scared that he would be harmed and maybe he would never see his daughter again.
Yeah, there's a lot of very sad stories out there that the average traveler often doesn't come across because, the average person who can afford to travel is pretty privileged usually. So
Yeah.
You're biking across America is a completely different form of travel in that sense, which would open you up to meeting some really interesting people.
Yeah, well said, Amanda. And I also like to acknowledge that I was very privileged to be able to even do this, to leave without any food or money. I'm very privileged in a position and fortunate to be able to do that because most people can't just leave with no food or money. But I'm in like 1% of people who can actually do that. And so I'm super privileged.
What made you decide to do this?
So I really started to feel the tension in the United States maybe, a couple of years ago. And at that same time, somebody gave me a book called The Kindness of Strangers. And it was I read the book and it was about a guy who hitchhiked across America in the 90s. Right. And he wrote about and he had no food or money with him. And he wrote about the different experiences that he had and the people that he met. And after reading that story, I thought, man, I would love to do something like that to get a good feel of the country. But I didn't want to hitchhike. So I thought, well, what if I were to ride my bike across the country instead? And that's what inspired me to do it.
I always think people who choose to do these things are a little bit crazy because it's it's much more comfortable at home. But putting ourselves into these less comfortable situations, typically some of the most rewarding times of our life, and it's obviously is what's happened with you.
That's well said. Yeah, if it makes any sense, it was a time where where I was feeling reckless, but in a good way. I was feeling this sense of adventurism and also recklessness of like, I want to go do something that I've never done before and challenge myself, et cetera, and learn about, humanity and myself, et cetera. And it just being gifted that book at that moment just felt like it was meant to be, Yeah,
it's funny how these things align sometimes. So I love that Daniel's whole trip there was really designed to have a lot of wonderful learnings and to spread a lot of them as well. Very, very cool. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to episode 337 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. All of my guests today have wonderful other parts of them that you can explore. So first of all, I chatted with Thomas Swick, and you can see his website, thomasswick.com, and he has a book out, Falling into Place, A Story of Love, Poland, and the Making of a Travel Writer, which is wonderful. I also chatted with Angela Correll, and similarly, you can find her at angelacorrell.com. And she has a book out, Restored in Tuscany, all about those really cool and sometimes crazy experiences. And lastly, I chatted with Daniel Troia. And Daniel actually has a documentary out called We Are All in This Together, which actually shows that trip that he described today. It is now streaming on a bunch of major platforms and picking up a bunch of awards too. So congratulations, Daniel. And you can find out where it's streaming and more about it at weareallinthis.together.movie.com. Of course, come and chat with us. We have a wonderful group of thoughtful travellers on Facebook and a similarly wonderful group on LinkedIn. Come along to either of those platforms. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers and you'll find us there. And don't miss out on some other news, writing, ideas, thoughtful stuff at the Thoughtful Travellers newsletter. You can find me on Substack by going to thoughtfultravel.substack.com. And there's also a chance there to sponsor me, at least by getting a little bit of extra additional content a month, or if you've been enjoying the podcast, just to throw a few, the old cover of coffee. That kind of thing. I hate asking for money, but anyway, it's there. And thank you very much to the people who are paid members of my Substack community. But there's tons of interesting stuff there without paying as well. I don't mind either way. Anyway, all of these links and more will be in the show notes. For this episode, you can find them at notaballerina.com/337. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.